Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another live community classroom with Michaels. We have our friend Marley Bird with us today, and we're going to be learning how to make the shifting rib knit dishcloth. My name is Renee L. from Yarn Inspirations, and I'll be helping with any questions you might have during today's class. Please feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and we'll make sure that Marley answers them. While we're getting ready to kick things off, let us know where you're watching from. Over to you, Marley.
Awesome. Well, hello, everybody. Marley Bird coming from Fishers, Indiana. I see a lot of Indiana people in here, so I thought I'd just give a shout out. I feel like it's like, I want to say hi to my mom. No. Anyways, so we are going to make, these are the jokes, people. We're going to make a dishcloth today, and you can choose to follow along with the pattern itself with the same cast on number in the pattern, or you could do a mini little face cloth size like what I'm going to do in class today, just so that we can get through the number of rows and whatnot that we need to. So you choose whichever you want to follow along with. You know how quickly you are I want to say how fast you knit better than I do. So you kind of make that decision for you, totally up to you. This is a very wonderful project, especially for beginners, because it forces you to read your knitting, to read your knits and your purls as they're on your knitting needles. You can use straight needles, you could use circular needles as straight needles to make this project. Either one works for you. The pattern calls for size 7 needles to get a gauge of 20 stitches per inch. I know my own gauge that I usually need size 8 needles to get that with this yarn. So I'm going to be using size 8 needles today, but you can use whatever size needles you need to use to get that gauge if you want to have the exact same size dishcloth as written in the pattern. Now, the great thing about dishcloths, you guys, is it doesn't matter what size they are, right? Like, it doesn't matter at all. You can have a big one, you can have a small one. They all still work really well. So I love having smaller ones that I use to, take off all my makeup. And so I am going to make one of those today. I'm going to use some Lily Sugar and Cream yarn. You could get 2 dishcloths with 1 ball of yarn. It's pretty easy. So if you're ready to go, let's go ahead and jump down here. I know that the pattern link has been provided in the chat by Renee, so you can grab that. And these dishcloths are really awesome. Yarn Inspirations sent me the ones that you actually see in the pattern itself, and you can obviously see there are so many different colors of Lily Sugar and Cream you could choose. So you could do a full rainbow-esque set like this and give them away. They're great for housewarming gifts. They're great for actually, if you doubled this, it's really great for like a burp cloth to throw over your shoulder if you have a baby. They're great for wedding shower. Like, they're just really awesome to make, and they're not difficult to make. Now, the pattern itself says that you want to cast on 41 stitches or a multiple of 2 plus 1. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do the multiple of 2 plus 1. And I'm gonna grab my yarn from the outside today, because I just don't feel like dealing with any yarn guts today. So I'm going to be pulling from the outside. And because we're doing a dishcloth and I want to make sure my edge is nice and tidy and a little bit stable, I'm going to do a long tail cast on. Now, you can do any type of cast on you want to make these dishcloths in reality. So if you are not a fan of the long tail cast on, or say as we're working through it, you're like, I'm having a hard time, and you just want to try something else, you absolutely can do that. But why not give this a try? When you do the long tail cast on, you want to make sure that you have a tail that's going to be estimated long enough for your entire project. So if this was going to be our whole project, we would want to make sure we have a tail that is at least 3 times the width of your project, plus a little extra. Now, for me, I probably would do 4 times, just because I like to err on the side of caution. And then it's at that point you will put your slip knot. Okay. The reason you need to do that is when we do the long tail cast on, we actually use our tail to cast on stitches. So we need to plan for that. Now we're going to do our slip knot. So I put the tail of the yarn in the palm of my hand, take my working yarn and wrap it around my forefinger and my middle finger. When I come back up, I cross it over. When I rotate my hand over, I'm going to take this tail and just secure it right there, just kind of pinch it. And then I'll go underneath this front loop, grab that back loop and pull all of that off of my fingers. And I get a slip knot, okay? We're going to put that slip knot on our knitting needles. Now, I do want to mention we are using 100% cotton yarn for this, which is really nice to use for dishcloths because they're easy to wash and it absorbs and it does all the things. But one thing that it will give you a little trouble with is it's a little bit stiff to work with. So you want to make sure you're not knitting too tight. And that starts right here at the very beginning as we're doing our cast on. So you want to make sure you're not casting on these stitches too snug. Put the tail of your yarn here. I'm going to hold my needle like this. Put your tail on the left side, put your working yarn on the right side. Okay. Now I want you to do this with your left hand. I call this the quacker. I know it's ridiculous. Trust me. I know, but that's what I call it, quacker. And I take the quacker and I come over here and I like stick it between those two strands. So my tail yarn now is like over here, over my thumb. My working yarn is over my finger. You guys see that? Now with my quacker, I'm going to make like a gun, like bang, bang. All right. So I'm going to go bang, bang. You see now, even more so, the yarn is over my thumb, yarn is over my finger. These three fingers down here that aren't doing anything, I'm going to grab the tail and grab the outside part of my working yarn and just grasp them in those three fingers. At this point, you should have what looks like a slingshot. Can you see that? So your yarn is going outside your thumb, outside your finger, and it comes together inside underneath those three fingers. You guys see that? It's like a slingshot. You're going to take your needle now, hold on to that slip knot. You don't want it to go anywhere. You guys have taken my class before, you know, I like to control my stitches, right? We don't get to control many things in life. Let's control our stitches. So I'm going to hang on to that stitch, come over here to the bottom of my thumb. I'm going to scoop up my thumb to grab that yarn. Now I swivel all the way over here to the tip of my finger and I come down my finger and I grab that yarn. Now what's going to happen, I'm going to swing my needle through the window that I've created right there at my thumb. And I swing it through just like so. And then that yarn right there that I had picked up on my finger is now going to be a stitch. So I'll let the yarn that's on my thumb fall off. And when I pull my tails down here, it's going to snug up the loop that was on my thumb. And now everything's tightened up. You want to make sure you don't tighten it too tight. All right. Then we adjust, we do it all again. So here we go. Quacker, come in, gun, grasp those outside tails or the outside string, and you're in your slingshot. Up the thumb, down the finger, through the window, off the thumb, and adjust. Up the thumb, down the finger, through the window, off the thumb. Pull those tails and start again. Up the thumb, down the finger, through the window, off the thumb. Now, if you've got this, keep going, cast on a multiple of 2 plus 1. If you don't have this yet, let's try it another way. Same thing, it's still long tail cast on, but we're going to do it a different way. Here's your tail. It's still over here on this side. Here's your working yarn. It's still over here on this side. You're going to take your hand, and we're not going to do a quacker this time. Now we're going to grab that yarn, grab the tail. We're going to grab it. Okay. We're going to take our thumb and we're going to scoop it around that tail. You got that? So I scooped it around. What does that look like? It looks like just the way that long tail did, right? When we were doing it, it's just as it was over the thumb. So now we're going to come over here. So let's just kind of let our needle hang out. Come over here. We're going to grasp this yarn and we're going to continue on. We're going to go up our thumb just like we did before. We're going to take this yarn and we're going to wrap it around our needle just like a knit stitch. And then we're going to have that needle jump out the yarn that was on our thumb and pull it off. Grab your tail, scoop your thumb, what does this look like? And those of you who are knitters, have you ever thought about this? It looks very similar. Think of my thumb as a knitting needle. It's like your yarn. It's like this is the stitch on my knitting needle, right? I'm going into the stitch. I'm going to wrap my needle. I'm going to come out the stitch, and then I jump off the needle. Can you guys see that? Grasp, scoop, up, around, out, off. Now, all of that, like I'm using two hands to do all that, right? All of that is the same motion as I was showing you earlier with all of it in one hand. So if it's all in one hand, up the thumb, down the finger, out the window, off the thumb. If you're struggling to do this, just remember, it might take a little bit of practice. And if you have a more familiar way to cast on that you're comfortable with, go ahead and do that today. So that way you can get some stitches cast on. And maybe this is something you go back and check out later. I will let you know, I have like standalone videos on the long tail cast on the Marley Bird YouTube channel. So you could always go there and check it out and just practice, practice, practice. So you want a multiple of 2 plus 1. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. I'm going to do 19. Okay. You cast on whatever number you want. Okay. Once all these stitches are now cast on, they're in your right hand still. And when we knit, we use both hands, right? And we use both needles. And so far, we've only had one needle in our hand, right? So when we knit off of the needle that's in our left hand. So this needle now has stitches cast on. So we're going to put it over here in our left hand. Ta-da! Our left hand. We will now grasp our spare needle, whether it's a circular needle, straight, it doesn't matter, and put it into your right hand. Okay. I'm going to show you guys how to knit and purl with the yarn in your right hand as if you're English. Please bear with me because it's not my preferred way, in the sense that it's just something that I do when I teach. I actually like to knit with the yarn in my left hand, so I'll show you that way as well. But when I purl, it might look a little off, just in the sense that it might not look as smooth, but it doesn't mean I'm any less as knowledgeable, okay? So I just might not be as smooth. All right, so we are here on the first row. This will be considered our right side. So on our right side, we're going to slip the first stitch purlwise. And it doesn't say if we're supposed to slip in the front or in the back. Let me see if it says up in the abbreviations. It doesn't. So it doesn't tell us if we're supposed to slip purlwise with the yarn in front or purlwise with the yarn in back. Considering this is the right side of the fabric, I'm going to suppose that I'm supposed to slip with the yarn in back. All right, so I'm going to slip the first stitch with the yarn in back. And this is where we are. Now it says I'm going to knit one stitch. Well, that makes it perfect. My yarn's already there waiting for me. So I'm going to go into my stitch, just like I did when I went up my thumb, go around my needle, just like I did before, come out that stitch, just like when I came out my thumb, and then let that stitch jump off my needle. And now I have a new stitch on there. Now we have to purl one. So my yarn's in back. I have to bring my yarn between my needles. That's very important. Everybody repeat after me. When I go from a knit to a purl, I bring my yarn between my needles. If I went over top of my needles, look at that. I get a yarn over on there. We don't want that. So I want to go between my needles to the front. And now I'm going to purl. So I go from left to right. I'm going to go into the stitch from left to right. Thank you so much, Christine's computer. And then I'm going to take my yarn here, and instinctively we think that we're going to wrap like this. Okay. It just seems like, oh, that's so easy. I'm going to wrap that way, when I really want you to go this way. All right. So if you were thinking, how do I hold my needles so you can see it best? If I hold them like this, I want to go around, like I'm going to the back, coming around and back to the front. I do not want you to go around this way and to the front. All right. So it's it's almost like it's the long way, over top to the back and then back to the front. So that wraps the needle. And now we want to bring that wrap through that stitch. So I pop my needle through that stitch and off. Now I go from purl to a knit. So just the same thing. I bring my yarn between my needles to the back. Go into the next stitch as if to knit. So I'm going from the right into the stitch, stick the needle in, wrap my yarn, come out the stitch and off. I'm going to purl, go between my needles, go into the stitch from right to left. When I wrap, if I'm thinking of right to left, I'm on the right side of this needle here. I'm going from the right side around the back to the left side. And then I want to make sure that needle now gets through that stitch and off. Going from a purl to a knit. So I go between here. Going from right to left, go in, around my needle, come out and off. Those of you who want to hold your yarn in your left hand, I'll show you that. So I've got a purl, so I go between my needles to the front, into the stitch, around, see I'm still going the same way. It's going around to the right, around the back, back to the front, and come out the stitch and off. Yarn to the back, into the stitch, around, out, and off. To the front, into the stitch, around, out, and off. To the back, into the stitch, around, out, and off. To the front, into the stitch, around, out, and off. Now I'm just going to finish up this row. And you just keep repeating this all the way to the end. Knit one, purl, and repeat to the end of row. Slip one, knit one, purl, knit, 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 purl. Why am I ending on a knit? Did I miscount when I started off? I must have. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to knit those two together. I must have miscounted somehow. That's all right. I'll just knit those two together. Oh, I should have purled those two together. Whoops. I'm going to purl those two together to get rid of it so I can end with the purl one. And I'll just do that. Okay. Now I see somebody in the chat is talking about they're left-handed. So when you're left-handed, you actually hold your yarn. Like if you're a true left-handed knitter and that you knit with the stitches in your right hand, then I have to think through this. My stitches are mounted in such a way right now that the back leg is ahead. So for me, when I knit left-handed, I will go through the back leg to knit. So if I was going to knit this one, I would go through the back leg and then I go up over top and I come out and off, bring my yarn between my needles. Sorry, you're going to have to bear with me here. And then you would purl. So you don't want to go this way. You want to go over top and off. Bring my yarn between my needles. Knit between my needles. Purl between my needles. Knit between my needles. purl. Anybody else like, oh my gosh, she's knitting left-handed? Because I'm impressing myself right now just a little bit. As I look away, and then between my needles and purl. Oh, I almost did the wrong way. And so on and so forth. So you would do that all the way down the row, and you would get your stitches the way you need them to. So I'm gonna undo this because that's not what I want for the rest. Hopefully that is helpful. Is that helpful to you, Tamara? Hopefully that's Tamara. If that's not helpful, Tamara, there is a suggestion in the chat saying that you could look through a mirror. You absolutely could. Like, that's one way to do it. Another thing, Tamara, is if you wanted to, because when we knit, we use both our right and our left hand, you could knit just like I want to say quote unquote right-handed people do, because obviously we're still using our right and left hand just like you do. So you could give this a try if you wanted to. No, I'm not telling you have to by any means. I'm just saying you could give this a try. All right, you get to the end of the row and we turn, and it's time that we're on row 2. So I'm going to hold my yarn over here again. Row 2, it says slip 1 purl. All right, so can I be real for you guys for a second? Can you go to my face real quick? All right, I'm going to be real. You guys ready for this? I absolutely hate when I have to slip the first stitch of a row. You know why? Because I always forget. Every single time I forget to slip that stitch. Then I forget if I need to hold the yarn in the back, if I have to hold the yarn in the front. I absolutely despise slipping the first stitch. I understand the benefit of it. I understand it gives a really beautiful, nice edge. I get it. I hate it. So this is me giving you permission to not slip that first stitch if you don't want to. What you would do is go ahead and go back down to my hands. If you don't want to slip that first stitch, pay attention to what the pattern says. So the pattern says for us to slip this first stitch and then purl 1, right? Well, we know we're doing a knit 1, purl 1 stitch pattern. So if I'm supposed to purl the second stitch, just by obvious elimination, we should then have this stitch be a knit, right? So then I go ahead and knit it. I'm not going to slip it. I'm going to knit it because I'm a rebel. I'm wearing red lipstick today and I'm a rebel. Here we go. So I'm just going to knit that stitch and then I can purl my next stitch. So I'm going to go in and purl my stitch. Bring my yarn between the needles and knit the next stitch. So for this whole row, we're still maintaining the ribbing pattern, right? The ribbing pattern doesn't change actually until we get to row 5, I think is what it is. So right now you could think of this as you're knitting your knits and you're purling your purls so that you don't really have to think too much about it, right? But when we get to, I think it's row 5, that's when things get different. That's when we would change up the pattern. And then we'd have one row where it's the opposite. So that way, man, that stitch got really big. I don't want that big. So that way we can get that really cool shifting rib pattern. And you can see here, it's just a matter of remembering to move that yarn between your needles. Move the yarn between your needles. Make sure you're making sure that they're all the same size. Like I made that one way too wide. All right. And that's something I normally wouldn't have any problem with. Like normally I'd have no issue with my stitches accidentally getting a little too wide. But when I'm working with cotton, it sticks on me a little bit. So there's a problem there. So for me, I'm actually going to tink back. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go into the stitch beneath the stitch on my needle. Okay. So the stitch on my needle is the daughter. The stitch underneath is the mother. The mother, you can see that the yarn is coming through the mother. Can you see that? So I'm going to take my left-hand needle and I'm going to stab it through the mother. I know it sounds disgusting, but that's what you're doing. You're putting it right through that mother stitch and let the daughter fall off the left-hand or the right-hand needle. And when you pull your yarn out, now the mother stitch is back on that needle. You see that? All right. So it's called tinking. I'm going to come over here. You can find the daughter. It's the one that's on the needle. Look for the mother underneath it. And if you have trouble finding it, like look where the yarn is coming through. You can actually like make it really nice and wide. Stick your left-hand needle into the mother. Let the daughter fall off. Into the mother, daughter falls off. Into the mother, daughter falls off. Into the mother, daughter falls off. Now I'm over here to where my stitch was really big, right? I just undid it. So now I can redo it. So if I wanted it to make it so it looks really nice and uniform, you can always just tink back just like I did and then do it all over again. So now I'm going to hold the yarn in my opposite hand. And something that I will do when I'm working with cotton, you guys, is I will periodically pause and make sure all my stitches are pulled down on my right hand needle. So that way they're not like gaping up on each other, or like maybe it kind of got stuck as it was creating the stitch. Sometimes it will do that. So I will just pull the yarn down and it puts it in place. Okay. What is this? On row 2, I accidentally did a knit, then a purl instead of a purl, then a knit. Should I continue that way? So it all depends if you want to have that be a design feature. For me, I would, since you're just so new into the pattern, I would tink back like what I just showed you, and then I would redo it to correct it. That's what I would do. And then see here, I'm going to get down to the end. I'll finish with my knit. See, I started with the knit, ended with the knit. And when I turn my work, I'm not going to slip that first stitch. What am I going to do? I'm going to purl it because I can. So I turn my work. I'm not going to slip my first stitch. I'm going to purl it. By a process of elimination, I know my next stitch is a knit, and I can see on row 3, it's supposed to be a knit. This one's going to be a purl. So I'm just going to purl it. I know I'm that person. I absolutely despise slipping the first stitch. I am not a fan. You can, if you want to, if you're able to keep track. But by the time I finish, and guys, I have been knitting more than 20 years. And by the time I finish, like I'll have half the stitches slipped, half of them not. Like it looks pathetic. So I choose to make my life less complicated and just keep the stitches going. And then like, I don't mind those little bumps or anything like that. That just gives me a little bit more grip on my dishcloth or on my face cloth to exfoliate a little bit better, right? All right. Here we go. You can see the ribbing is really starting to show up. If you've done everything correctly, you should see knits on top of knits and purls on top of purls. Row 4 is just a repeat of row 2 again, which is just knitting your knits and purling your purls. Sure, I could show you how to fix. I'm going to show you how to fix if you were at the end of the row like this. Say we found a mistake. So we're at the end of the row. Make sure your work, that you're like the row you're going to tink is in your right hand, right? Because what we're ultimately doing, we're taking our stitches that were on our left, because the ones that were on our left that we knit off are now the mothers. And we want to put those mothers back on our left-hand needle. So take your yarn. I like to hold my yarn. I hold my yarn over here, and then I pull this down. So that way I can really identify the mother, right? Because you can see where the daughter's on top. I put my needle through the mother, drop the daughter. Needle through the mother, drop the daughter. Now you're going to have to readjust, right? Because you're getting more and more slack in your yarn. So pause, readjust, go into the mother, drop the daughter, into the mother, drop the daughter, into the mother, drop the daughter. And it doesn't matter if it's a knit or a purl. You go into the same way. In the mother, drop the daughter, in the mother, drop the daughter, in the mother, drop the daughter. Say this is where your mistake was. Then you can look at your work and say, okay, this is where you would read your knitting. You can see right here that you have knitting, a column of knit stitches here, and we're stacking our knits at this point. So we know we just see a purl bump right there. So we just finished a purl. We're going to go to a knit. So you would continue on with your knit and with your purl, and then with your knit and with your purl, and so on and so forth. Now, as we do row 4, again, it's just it's the same repeat, just like we've been doing, right? It's the same thing. It's in row 5 where things change up. But I'm going to give you guys another tip here. If you don't want to change it up, if you're like Marley, I just got the ribbing. I don't want it to shift. I don't want to do any of that. You don't have to. You could just keep this all ribbing, you guys. You don't have to make it a shifting rib if you don't want to. You just have yourself another pattern. turn our work. Again, I'm not going to slip my first stitch. I'm going to knit it, and I process of elimination because I see a purl right there. So I'm just going to knit this stitch, purl, knit. I'm going to do that all the way down. I'm going to go a little quickly on this one so that way we can get to row 5. Because row 5 is where we want to make sure we can identify our stitches as well as follow the pattern, okay? And before I start row 5, I'm actually going to ask Renee how the chat's doing. Are there any special questions? Anything she needs to bring to my attention? This is Renee from Yarn Inspirations, everybody. Say hello. Hi, Renee.
Hi, everyone. You know what? I think everyone's been pretty good for the most part.
Okay.
You know, you're catching the questions as they happen. One thing is, so Tatiana has a crochet hook. Now,
Okay.
Marley, I'm going to ask, is there, if people really needed to use what was in their house, because we've talked about this before of like stitch markers, you know, what do you do? How do you substitute when you don't have stitch markers? Is there a way we could make that work? I wonder.
A crochet hook instead of a knitting needle? The answer is yes. And she would actually want to look into Tunisian crochet more so than knitting. Because Tunisian crochet is like a combination of knitting and crochet. Whereas if this was a crochet hook, you would actually work through your stitches. So you got loops on your hook. And then you would yarn over, draw through 2, yarn over, draw through 2, yarn over, draw through 2, so that you follow, you're like binding them off. Essentially, it's not the right word to use. But you could finish them off, and then you do the next row, you're picking up stitches, then you're finishing them off. So it takes 2 rows to complete 1 row in Tunisian. If you wanted to use a crochet hook for knitting, technically you could do something called nooking. But it's better if you do grab actual knitting needles to attempt the knitting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's great.
All right.
Yeah, the hooks are tricky because they would stop you up a little bit.
It would trick you up a little bit, but I highly encourage you to check out Tunisian crochet. I actually have a big, I'm going to call it, it's a By Crafty boot camp, but it'll be focused on Tunisian crochet, and it'll be out this summer on my YouTube channel. So if you, I don't know how long you want to wait, Tatiana, but you can wait that long if you want. Otherwise, there are some excellent Tunisian crocheters on YouTube, specifically TL Yarncraft. Tony is fantastic. I love her and I trust her, and she knows what she's talking about. All right. Anything else?
Amazing. I am just going through. I think we covered most of this off. On row 2, I accidentally did knit and purl. I'm going to read this out. We might have covered this already. Sorry, while I was going through other things. The question is, hi, on row 2, I accidentally did knit, then purl instead of purl, then knit for the first 2 stitches after slipping. Should I continue on that way or change back to the P1, K1 now and just leave those 2 stitches as I don't know how to fix them?
Right. So that's where I had told her that she should tink back and fix them now. Perfect. Like just, once you tink them back, they're back to their original, and then continue on from there, especially since you're at the start of the project. Just take a minute and tink. And if you guys haven't heard the word tink before, it's actually knit spelled backwards. Because you're unknitting your work. So you're tinking your work. All right, so here we are. Hopefully you have a little bit of fabric going on here. When your ribbing is all together, all nice and tight, it actually kind of looks a little bit like stockinette, right? Because you can't see those purl gutters is what I call them. But when you separate them out, you should be able to see your columns of knits, which look like those V's, and then those columns of those purl bumps, okay? It's now that we're going to go to row 5, and it's on row 5 where we're going to alternate knitting your knits and purling your purls to shift the column of ribbing. So as I turn on row 5, before, if I was maintaining the pattern, I would be purling this first stitch, right? Because I can see a purl bump there, and I would be knitting the next stitch. But on row 5, we're changing it up. So what row 5 has you do is slip as if to purl, which I'm not going to do. And then it tells you to purl the first stitch and then knit the next stitch. So it's having you do the opposite. Can you see that? Now it's only going to look like it's the opposite on row 5, because when we get to row 6, it's going to be exactly what you're looking at. On row 7, it's going to be exactly what you're looking at. On row 8, it's exactly what you're looking at. But because row 5 is different than row 3, that's what's going to shift our numbers here. Okay, so here we go. If I'm supposed to purl this one, by process of elimination, I know I'm supposed to knit this one. So I'm going to knit it instead of slipping it. So I'm going to knit this one. You can slip it as if to purl, up to you. This one, I was looking at knits. You guys see that? I'm looking at knits, the column of knits, but the pattern tells me I'm supposed to purl. So I bring my yarn in front of my needle, go into the stitch from right to left, around my needle, and it's the long way, right? It's the long way around the needle. Come out and off. I have to knit the next one. Yarn to the back, go into the stitch from left to right, yarn around my needle, out and off. And then you just carry on. Like we've established it now, right? We've established it's one knit, one purl, one knit, one purl. So it's really like the first couple ones you have to pay close attention to, because once you establish that in your head, you can think of purl, okay, and then I knit, and then I purl, and then I knit. And then when somebody comes and talks to you and you kind of get distracted and you're like, I don't know if I just knit or if I just purl, you can take a look at your work. Look at your right hand needle. If you see a purl bump right up next to the loop on your needle, you know that was a purl. So that means that one was a knit, which means your next one should be a purl. And we know that because we're putting purls on top of this columns of knits for row 5, which it's like, okay, good, I'm back on track. Because I don't know about you guys, but my kids love to bother me when I'm in the middle of a row. They love to ask questions. They love to shout out numbers. I mean, they're teenagers and they embrace that 110%. So you get to the end of the row. It looks a little bit messy up there right now, right? Because we don't have any more fabric establishing anything. But when we turn, what you're going to notice now is we're back to our knitting the knits and purling the purls. We're back to our knitting the knits and purling the purls because we now have reestablished our columns. This was our knit column. Now we've moved it over here. So I'll start off with the purl one, or you can slip one purlwise, up to you. And then I'll knit. And then I'll purl. And then I'll knit. And then I'll purl. So on and so forth. You guys see that? So Ronnie is asking if she wanted to make, he or she, I don't know if it's a he or she, if they wanted to make a placemat, how many would they cast on? Well, the answer to that question really lies in what your gauge is. And all that means is how many stitches per inch are you getting? If you want your placemat to be 12 inches and you're getting 5 stitches per inch, well, then you would multiply 12 times 5, which is 60. And you would want to cast on 60 stitches plus 1, right? Because the multiple is 2 plus 1. So 60 is your multiple of 2. So you would have to do plus 1. Does that make sense? It always boils down to what your gauge is. How many stitches per inch are you getting on the needles and the yarn you are using? It's just like if you were going to build a house. If you were to build a house and an architect gives you the plans and the material list and it says, go buy all of this lumber. So you buy all this lumber, right? You buy the exact lumber that the architect told you to do. And the architect says, okay, cut this piece of wood so that it measures 9 inches. So that way, as you're building the house, this 9-inch piece of wood is going to hold up, or 9 foot or whatever it is, you know, it's going to hold up that wall so that everything else that goes along with it all fits into place so you can build your house, right? Well, if you wanted a placemat, we would be like, all right, so here's your materials. I want you, for however wide you want your placemat to be, 12 inches, like we said, I want you to make sure you're getting 5 stitches for every inch. So that way you can get your 12 inches. So what you would have to do is find what size needles to use that goes with your yarn to give you those 5 stitches. So that way, when you cast on your 61 stitches, you'll get 12 inches. Does that make sense to anybody? Hopefully it does. And that's where, I mean, that's where things go rogue. When people are given, you know, knitters and crocheters are given a pattern, they're given a material list, they're given the gauge, they're given what size needle the designer used to get that gauge, which does not necessarily mean you will use that same needle size, because gauge is totally dependent on you. Like, it's not a standard. So like, for example, this pattern calls for size 7 needles to get gauge, and I have to use size 8s. But regardless, you use whatever size needles you need to use to get the gauge given, because the gauge given is used mathematically to get the size of whatever you're making. So the building a house analogy really works well, especially when you're talking about making a sweater, because you have to have all the pieces be the correct size so that the sweater can get put together just like a house. Whereas if you disregard the gauge and create, you know, pieces that aren't even the correct measurement a little bit, your sweater is not going to work out. It's either going to be too big, too small, or completely misshapen, and you're going to be frustrated. So as much as gauge is a pain in the rear, it is very important. Not necessarily in a dishcloth. Like I said, it doesn't matter the dishcloth, but that's how you would figure out what size. All right, so because I've been talking, I totally lost what row I'm on. So what I would do in a situation like this is I would turn my work and I would start to count how many rows I've done since I did my last one, right? So my guess here, that would be right side, or that would be 5. No, 5 is 5, 6, 7, 8. Have I done 8 rows? I don't think so. I think I don't think I've done 7. I have to do one more, I do believe. I could be wrong. Those of you watching the replay, I know what you're going to do. You're going to rewind it and you're going to count how many rows I've done. You'll be like, no, she's wrong. It doesn't matter. It's just a dishcloth. It doesn't matter. You know that's what's going to happen. You know that's what's going to happen. All right.
Christine, I hope that answered that. Sometimes you get into a flow. Sometimes
Yeah,
you're having a time.
I'm like, okay. So, I mean, row 8 is a wrong side row and I'm on a wrong side. So that's where I'm just like, I think that's what I am. I think I'm on row 8. So I'm going to do row 8, and then row 9 is where I would do the repeat. So you would go back to row 1. All right, going back. Cotton yarn is tricky to work with, you guys. So I do want to remind you, it's not that it's impossible, and it does feel really good when the project is done, but it does not have any give. So it will put some stress and strain on your joints. So make sure you do take a chance, take a minute to take some breaks, stretch your hands out to give them a little bit of a relaxation. I'm going to have to do that at the end of this row, actually. So I'll show you guys what I do, because I can already feel the little stretch, just what I'm doing here. I can feel it in my knuckles. So what I will do as I finish this, and I am not a doctor, I am not professed, like this is just what I do. I'm not telling you like this is any sort of medical advice, but I will usually set my work down and I take my hands and I'm not pressing on it. I'm not pressing on it with this hand, but I'm pressing down to try and get flat to the surface. Does that make sense? To stretch out my hand a little bit. And then I'll go this way. Oh, it feels so good on my wrist. It feels so good. Cotton yarn it's hard to work with, and it splits sometimes. So you've got to just work through it. But it's worth it.
Agreed. As someone that just injured my ring finger from aggressive crocheting, take breaks, please take breaks, especially with cotton.
Right. Yeah. So this is just a basic rubber band, y'all. I mean, I guess it's not basic, it's ombre. But I do this especially for crochet, but I will put my fingers in a rubber band and then stretch the rubber band to stretch this muscle right here. Because I find, especially in crochet, because I hold my crochet hook like a pencil, I put a lot of stress right there. But then even as I'm holding my knitting needles, like you can feel right there, like that's just, it gets really tight. So I will use a rubber band as like a reverse of it all. Does that make sense? I don't know. I did have a doctor tell me this to do this. That's where I picked it up. But that's what I do, other than just taking a break in crocheting. So that way, or knitting, so I can get a little bit of a break.
Ashley said she uses silly putty to exercise her fingers, which I think is genius.
That's good too. That's good too. It's always nice too, if you're going to take a little bit of a longer break, if you take some lotion, because you don't want your hands to be greasy, right, when you're working. So if you are going to take a long enough break that the lotion can actually absorb, take some lotion and really rub it into the palms of your hands, and then go like this over your knuckles, and just really just put some force and rub, and, you know, just kind of let them know you still love them and they're doing a good job, and, you know, all the things. But you do want to make sure that, you know, your lotion's going to dry. Otherwise your knitting needles are going to be all slippery. All right. Yes. Breaks are key. Okay. So I've reached the end of row 8. I'm turning my work. I'm starting row 9, and row 9 is really, it's a repeat of all this. So now I'm back to row 1, but can you see the shift of the ribbing? So we started over here and the ribbing shifted here. So on this one, now it's shifting back over. So this will be, what is this? If I don't slip the first stitch, you start row 1 with a purl 1, row 2, you would do the first stitch is in the pattern. Yeah, so I'm going to talk you through that. I just lost my train of thought completely. What was I saying?
Were we counting?
Gosh. I don't think I was counting. I don't remember what I was going to say. I'm so sorry. I had a brain fart. I know what it was. So we're starting row 9. Okay. And row 9, which is a repeat of row 1. So rows 1 and 5 are the rows in which, when you do those, it's going to shift where your columns are. All right. So when we do rows 1 and 5, that shifts where our columns are. All the other rows, you get to knit your knits and purl your purls. But when you're on 1 or 5, that's when things change up. So I'm back over here. I'm going to do row 1, which I know row 1, this second stitch here starts with a knit. So I know automatically this is going to be a purl, right? Process of elimination. So I'm going to purl this first stitch. If I didn't slip it, if you slip it, then you slip it. And then I knit 1 and I purl 1, and I go into pattern, and it becomes very easy. Like I said, I think the trickiest part is counting your rows if you just get in a rhythm. So one thing you could do is you could take a marker and mark the right side of your fabric. So this is the right side. So every time you're on this side, you know, you're on an odd row. So if you were counting, like this is actually how I decided where I was before. I realized I was on the other side. And so I had to be on an even row, which means I either overshot the number of rows I needed to do, or I needed to do one more. And just looking at my work, I could see I didn't have too many. So I knew I was on a row 8. Unless those of you who have rewound and are like, no, you weren't at all, you can be like, she's lying. Well, that's what I thought. All right. Just don't judge me. There are no knitting police. Don't judge me. It's where I thought I was, and I'm going to stick to it because it looks right to me. I am like so curious to know how many people are going to rewind, because now they're be like, well, now I have to know. So, oh, you're welcome, Michaels. You're getting a lot more play on your video.
People will absolutely come back to fact check.
I know, right? All right, so I'm turning my work and I'm getting ready to do my row 2. So right here, I know I'm going to purl. So I'm purling my purls, knitting my knits, right? So I'm going to knit the first one, or you can slip it, and then I'm purling. And I'm knitting and I'm purling. Like, you guys got this. You got this at this point, for sure. Do you have to slip purlwise, or can you slip knitwise? So rule of thumb is that you should always slip purlwise unless a pattern tells you otherwise. The reason you do that is because when you slip knitwise, you actually twist, you change the orientation of the stitch. So if you do that, the stitch is going to lay different on your needles. So the rule of thumb is to slip purlwise and then carry on your way. Could you slip knitwise? Absolutely. I just told you there are no knitting police. You could do that and say it's a design feature. I mean, shoot, if I can knit and purl the first stitch, you can change it up and slip it like to knit if you wanted to. Totally up to you. I'm not going to judge in any way, shape, or form. Okay. I did not do this, but what would you do if you dropped a stitch? Oh, that's a very good question. All right, I can show you knitwise. Okay, I'm going to show you how to fix a drop a stitch, but in the meantime, what does it mean purlwise or knitwise? When we purl, we put our needle in this way. When we knit, we put our needle in that way. That's the difference. This is slipping purlwise. So you put your needle in, it's like tip to tip. If you do knitwise, you go from left to right, and that would be knitwise. Okay. All right, let me get across and I'll show you how to fix a drop stitch. And let's do it on the knit one. Let's pretend I dropped that stitch. Oh no, what are we gonna do? Say it ain't so. All right, dropped a stitch. I caught it. I'm like, oh, that's close. I didn't let it go too far, right? I didn't let it go too far. I can stop it, put a stitch marker in it. Say I found it after the fact. Say I'm down here and it's all the way over here. I could put a stitch marker in it to stop it so it doesn't go anywhere and then finish my row, right? I could do that. If it drops off just like it did right there and you're like, oh no, what happens? Okay, I'm going to put a stitch marker in it until I can assess the situation. So I'm going to put this here so that way I can have a little bit more contrast and hopefully that will help. If you look at this pretty closely, I can see, okay, we have shifting stitches going here. I stop the stitch and I can see that the stitch that is beneath it, so to speak, it's a purl, right? And I can see that I have 2 strands of yarn right here that are like a run and a pantyhose, right? Those are the strands of yarn that are now loose, that are like hanging out. Those 2 strands of yarn used to be through this stitch. They used to be part of that stitch. So what we need to do is make them part of that stitch again. So what you could do, you could grab one of these. Actually, this is funny because I use this to point things out all the time, but it's like a stitch catcher because it has a pointy edge and it has a hook edge that you can fix stitches. So I'm, in a funny way, I'm using it for what it's used for, and I didn't even intend to do that. All right, here's my drop stitch. Here are my strands of yarn. If I were to take this drop stitch, now I'm going to put it onto, I'm going to put my hook. I'm going to use a hook into it. It doesn't have to be a hook, but I'm just going to put my hook into it. And I want to put it in there so that way it looks like it would if it were resting on my needle, meaning I want the right leg a little bit ahead of the left leg. Does that make sense? So I wouldn't want it like that. See right there, the back leg is ahead of that one. I want it the other way. Just like if it were on a knitting needle. You guys with me on that? And now we're literally going to knit with that strand of yarn. So I have it on my hook. I can use my knitting side or my hook side. It doesn't matter to me. Have it on my hook. The yarn is forward. I'm going to grab that first strand, the one lowest. Okay, you can grab it and pull it through your loop and then come up. I split my yarn, so I got to fix it a little bit. Come up, and now I just fixed that knit stitch. I go to the next one. I can go underneath or over top. You do what you think looks best, okay? Let's go over top this one. I'm going to go over top and pull it through and pull that up. When I go over top, can you see that puts the back leg forward? Let's see what it does when I go underneath. I go underneath and pull it through, first off, it's trickier. If I go underneath, it puts that front leg forward. So it makes it more of an actual knit stitch. I don't have any more rows to pick up and go. Okay. That's the working yarn. That's not an actual row. I don't have any more rows to pick up and go. And I know that this stitch hasn't been knit yet. So I'm going to put that stitch back on my left-hand needle. And I go on my merry little way. Can you see that? Could you guys see all that? Yes, no, maybe so. I see Michelle kind of nodding. She's kind of like, maybe, I don't know. All right, good. You guys can see that. So I'm going to go on. So I would just keep on going. I'll be completely honest with you. If you drop a purl, I would put a stitch marker in it and wait till you get to the other side to where you could knit it, right? Because this column of purls on the opposite side is a column of knits. So I would just turn around and just fix it on the knit side. Like that's what I would do. And I know you guys want to do what I would do. So that's totally what I would do. It's just easier. But yeah, and you could do the same thing if, say, that stitch right there needed to be a knit. Let's just say you needed it to be a knit. You could purposely drop a stitch, undo them. We'll undo this one that was a purl, right? We're going to undo it and we're going to make it a knit. So now there's my stitch, right? That I don't want to go anywhere. My purl bump was in front of it. So that was my ladder, right? That's my ladder. I'm going to make sure my ladder's behind it. And then I can pick up my stitches and go. So I'm going to pick up this time with my knitting needle. Let me see if I could do this. So if I pick up with my knitting needle, I scoop underneath the first one and then I scoop it through. Actually, here, I'll show you this. This is actually easier than anything. I'm going to show you if you don't have a tool, because this is what I do. All right, so there's my stitch. I put my stitch on my left-hand needle just like it would be if it were just on a regular whatever. I go into it. I find the bottommost bar. I wrap it around my right-hand needle, and then I pull it through. Right? Then I'll put that stitch on my left-hand needle again. Go into it. Find the bottommost bar. Pull it through. Put that stitch on my left-hand needle. Go into it. Find the next bar, pull it through, put that stitch by my left-hand needle. There's no more bars. And now all my stitches are knits. I never, ever, ever use I shouldn't say ever. If I'm fixing cables, I use other things, but typically I just use my knitting needles to fix my stitches. All right. So I'll get to the end of this. This is how you do the shifting rib knit dishcloth. I know you guys had a great time. Make sure you let everybody know you enjoy these classes here at Michael's and you enjoy the Yarnspirations patterns. And specifically, you enjoy the Yarnspirations ambassadors because we're amazing. So if I say so myself, last but not least, if you want to go to my face, can I just tell you how weird that sounds to be like, go to my face, please. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. I hope you learned a little bit of something, whether you're making the dishcloth or maybe you learned the long tail cast on or how to read your stitches, or if me just simply telling you, you don't have to slip the first stitch. Great. You don't have to slip the first stitch. It's not mandatory for most patterns. Like I very rarely do. The only time I usually slip the first stitch is if I'm doing a heel of a sock. But that's neither here nor there. I hope you enjoyed the class. Make sure that you do give us a thumbs up if you're watching on the YouTube channel. Don't forget to hit subscribe. If you want to join me over on the Marley Bird YouTube channel, you absolutely can. It's just Marley Bird, MarlyBird, like the animal. And then as you make these dishcloths, share with us on social media. All right, Renee, it's over to you.
Awesome. Thank you everyone so much for joining us today for this live community classroom with Michaels. Don't forget to share your work with hashtag Make It With Michaels and hashtag Yarnspo, and that's YARNSPO. And just a reminder that you can find more classes on michaels.com and the recording of today's class at michaels.com/classes. All right, thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye guys.